I started volunteering before my docent duties, working with Diane Everman in the archives. My first part was I helped catalog and do a database for our oral histories. But for, maybe about a year now, I've been working on cataloging a collection of Army Signal Corps photos. And there's over 1,300 of them. So some are soldiers just going about their daily business. Some are soldiers repairing Jeeps or machines. But we do have a number of photos that deal with liberation, Buchenwald, Nordhausen, concentration camps. And a large chunk of those photos dealing with liberation were the Hadamar Sanitarium or the Hadamar Asylum. And I was really unfamiliar with this. It was really not a name I'd come across studying the Holocaust. So I started doing research, and this Hadamar institution was one of the main Nazi euthanasia killing centers in Germany. So you might recognize this photo from our exhibit, the portion that talks about the T4 program. So that's a picture of Hadamar. You can see the smoke. So first, a few things about euthanasia. The definition: giving a quiet and easy death, kind of a peaceful, painless death. That can be voluntary when the patient is able to make decisions and voice their wishes, but also it can be involuntary. Patients who are suffering from a terminal illness excuse me, or are in a coma, and it's unlikely that they will come out of a coma. Usually a third party then may intervene to end the suffering. But that's when a patient is no longer capable of decision making, and that's a very slippery slope. And that is kind of the path in which Nazi euthanasia took its course. So eugenics was a term first proposed by a British naturalist, Francis Galton, in 1881. The science of the improvement of race by better breeding. And we now know that this science really has no merit. It's not scientifically valid. But it was the idea of breeding these positive traits and kind of trying to breed out the undesirable traits. Euthanasia was also promoted by Adolf Jost in 1895, his work, The Right to Death. And even into the early 1900s, 1920, the permission to destroy life unworthy of life, which is a term I know you all are familiar with. We heard that learning a little bit about the Nazi euthanasia program. And that was by Carl Binding and Alfred Hoch. These eugenicists believe that life, the right to live, was not, you were not entitled to it. It was something that you earned, and you earned it by being a contributing member of society. And these patients or individuals with disabilities, mental illness, had less intelligence, more antisocial behaviors, and therefore less human value. And so euthanasia was promoted as a mercy. You're ending the suffering of these individuals, and you're also relieving the burden on their families and on society as a whole. So justification, according to Carl Binding and Alfred Hoke, their life is absolutely pointless, but they do not regard it as being unbearable. They are a terrible, heavy burden upon their relatives and society as a whole. Their death would not create even the smallest gap, except perhaps in the feelings of their mothers or loyal nurses. And the move towards euthanasia started with sterilization. In 1933, Nazi sterilization law, psychiatrists and the healthy person are allies against the genetically defective. The psychiatrist must render his service to the ultimate aim of an able and superior race. They then passed the law against dangerous habitual criminals, which targeted what they termed criminal asocials, which kind of is an umbrella term. You can almost put anybody into that, that category. And these criminal asocials, they could be held in a psychiatric facility for an indeterminate period of time. And in the case of sex offenders, they could be castrated. The Nuremberg laws passed in 1935, they didn't just regulate marriage between Jews and non-Jews, Aryans and non-Aryans. It also looked at the marriage between people with these disabilities, not wanting these traits to keep evolving in society. So that was also part of the marriage health law in 1935. Targets of sterilization, medical experimentation, and then eventual euthanasia, those with physical disabilities, mental illnesses, also Jews, Romani, the gypsies, Mischling, the mixed, particularly Jew and non-Jew, or gypsy and some other nationality or ethnicity. Twins, those who suffered from epilepsy, those with dwarfism, the incurably insane, the feeble-minded, and asocial criminals, those umbrella terms. So these were the most vulnerable members of society. And they were used as specimens. They were looking for evidence of where these traits come from and to help reinforce this idea of superior race. So they looked at a person's physical traits. They gave them so-called intelligence tests. And then in the case of euthanasia, many of those victims were autopsied, trying to look for the source of those undesirable traits. It's believed by 1939, the beginning of the war, 200,000 to 350,000 persons had been sterilized under this new Nazi law. And Hitler was already proposing mass euthanasia in 1935. He believed that using the cover of war, that was the perfect opportunity to implement this plan of mass euthanasia. 1938, families were petitioning the courts to grant a mercy killing or mercy death to their children who had severe disabilities. And by August of 1939, just a month before the war, all doctors and midwives were required to report the birth of a child who had deformities, a cleft palate, a club foot. So even before the war, there was this government-sanctioned process for the murder of these undesirables. In October of 1939, Hitler signed this decree. Reich leader Bauer and Dr. Brandt they're given this responsibility for expanding the authority of physicians and to take patients considered incurable according to their best available human judgment, and granting them a mercy death. So now he has green-lighted the Third Reich to allow doctors to use their best judgment in euthanizing these individuals. So here's a copy of that decree. So it was signed in October, but Hitler backdated it to September 1st, 1939, the outbreak of the war, to make it look as though it was a wartime decree. So Hitler then started using the cover of the war to implement his plan to cleanse Germany of these undesirables. Heinrich Himmler, his order of April 1941, coded as 14 F13, which it was labeled special treatment. This was to take sick or infirm prisoners from the concentration camps to these euthanasia facilities. So medical personnel were sent to these camps to make a list of prisoners that would then be transported for liquidation. So it took a cooperation of bureaucrats from the highest level down to the doctors, nurses, and staff at these facilities. It was a huge bureaucratic machine that worked very efficiently. 7 main euthanasia centers in Germany and Austria: Brandenburg, Greifswald, Sonnenstein, Maestricht, Oberwald, and Hadamar. And let's see if I can move this. And Harthing. By the end of the war, there was an estimated 200 to 250,000 individuals who are victims of Nazi euthanasia. This number is probably low because they were doing or involved with the practice of euthanasia even before the war started. And with falsifying records and with many of these other euthanasia centers shutting down in the early 1940s, those records were destroyed and falsified. So the town of Hadamar near Limburg an der Lahn in Hesse, Germany, was founded in 1883 as a correctional institution for released prisoners, kind of like a halfway house. But the need for psychiatric facilities in Germany began to grow in the early 1900s. By 1906, Hadamar was a psychiatric facility. By 1930, they had 320 patients, and by the beginning of the war, they had 600 patients in a facility built for 250. It also became a military hospital. Sick rooms were refurbished for administrative staff, and most of the staff at Hadamar was transferred from another euthanasia facility, Greifswald, when that facility shut down in the early 1940s. So the first deaths at Hadamar and with the euthanasia program in general were caused by starvation, giving them limited rations so that they weren't using up resources during wartime for other people, for those who had desirable traits. Buses arrived daily carrying patients from other psychiatric facilities. They were received on the first floor and then taken down into the basement, where there were gas chambers disguised as shower rooms and also crematories. If you look at the back of this picture, and this is a picture that we do have in our collection, you can see the oven here. So a witness to one of these gas scenes. After doors were closed, The air was sucked out of the gas chambers through a ventilator by the same doctor who had carried out the earlier examination. For about 10 minutes, carbon monoxide was let into the room by that doctor, and the effect observed through a small window in the door. As soon as he thought that those shut in to the gas chamber had died, the gas chamber was emptied. Fresh air was forced into the gas chamber through the ventilation system, and the gas was forced out. From the beginning of the gassing until the reopening of that door took about an hour. Corpses for autopsy dissection were removed to a special room, but the majority were then taken immediately to the crematory ovens. Through the small window, I saw 40 to 45 men who were pressed together in the next room and were now slowly dying. Some lay on the ground, others had slumped down, many had their mouths open as if they could not get any more air. The form of death was so painful that one cannot talk of a humane killing, especially since many of the dead men may have had moments of clarity, knowing what's happening to them. I watched the process for about 2 to 3 minutes and then left because I could no longer bear to look and felt sick. Did I ever watch a gassing? Dear God, unfortunately, yes. And it was all due to my curiosity. Downstairs on the left was a short pathway, and there I looked through the window. In the chamber, there were patients, naked people, some semi-collapsed, others with their mouths terribly wide open, their chests heaving. I saw that. I have never seen anything more gruesome. I turned away. Went up the steps. Upstairs was a toilet. I vomited everything I had eaten. This pursued me days on end. Looking into the chamber, I could not imagine that this was completely without pain. Of course, I am a layman, and this is just my opinion. A few were lying on the ground. The spines of all the naked people protruded. Some sat on the bench with their mouth wide open, their eyes wide open, and breathing with difficulty. So they're doing this, but they know that it's not humane, and they're still continuing. They're not stopping it. So the killing at Hadamar ceased for a short time in 1941 because townspeople and clergy were protesting the activities that had been happening, because it was common knowledge what was happening at Hadamar. Bishop Hilfrid Limburg wrote that the children at his school, they would tease each other saying, "You'll end up in the Hadamar ovens." The townspeople could see the thick smoke from the crematoria. They saw the buses arriving. They saw the signs that led to the facility. They warned of epidemics of diseases, but they could see what was going on at this institution. In August of 1941, they celebrated the 10,000th person that was killed at Hadamar with music and a procession around the grounds. So I did find this picture online of that so-called celebration. Dr. Berner declared that the 10,000th corpse would be burnt today and that all personnel should attend. Toward evening, we gathered in the hall of the right wing where everyone was given a bottle of beer. And from there, we went down into the cellar. The naked body of a dead man with hydrocephalus lay on a stretcher. In answer to a question raised, I declared with certainty that it was a real corpse and not a paper one. The cremators put the body in a sort of trough and pushed it into the oven. Mr. Markle, who was the records keeper at Hadamar, dressed as a sort of clergyman and pronounced the funeral rites. So even though Hitler assured local residents that the euthanasia activities had ceased, about a year later, they start up again, kind of after this had blown over. Their method of murder changed from gas to overdoses of morphine and barbiturates. And they started practicing wild euthanasia, which means that the killings became automatic. Anyone who arrived was immediately murdered by lethal injection. In 1945, 476 Soviet and Polish prisoners, forced laborers, arrived at Hadamar, and they were diagnosed as tubercular in an exam after their death. And also in 1944, a ward in the hospital was set up for Jewish children of mixed marriages, and it was advertised as kind of an educational home. But these children were murdered upon arrival simply because they were considered Jewish under laws by the Third Reich. So healthy, perfectly healthy children murdered by lethal injection. So most of the bodies were burned in the crematory, but then after some of these protests, they started also burying the bodies so that the smoke wouldn't be rising out of the chimney. Buried in the local cemetery, but also buried in mass graves. There were over 400 mass graves discovered on the premises of Hadamar. And by 1944, they had 700 prisoners. Hadamar, the town of Hadamar, was captured by the US forces on March 26, 1945. Soon after the Allies entered the town, excuse me, they started hearing rumors from the townspeople about what had been happening. So on March 29th, they begin their investigation into these rumors. In Hadamar's pharmacy, they find large amounts of morphine and barbiturates, and also the gas chambers. They found survivors and also a number of corpses that were waiting to be cremated. Also uncovered over 400 mass graves. So then they began notifying the US War Investigation Commission and began collecting their evidence. It's believed that between 10 to 15,000 individuals were murdered at Hadamar. Could be as high as 20,000 because many of the death records were falsified, giving false causes of death, such as natural causes, tuberculosis, some type of infection. And then they start writing in military newspapers about what they had encountered when they entered Hadamar. So Hal Boyle, Associated Press war correspondent in the Evening Star, April 10th, 1945, American troops have discovered a German murder factory, rivaling any house of horror dreamed up by fiction writers, where it is estimated that 20,000 persons viewed by the Nazis as undesirables were systematically slain. Nazi murder mill found in asylum, starved till weak, 20,000 were slain in mercy killings. Nobody would believe it. It had underground chambers with dripping water, bats flying around, and little crazy men jumping out at you at every step. The head keeper showed us 481 graves in the cemetery. There were 3 fresh, empty graves. And when we asked him about that, he said, we always keep 3 graves ahead. After their 10,000th killing, they were told that SS men had a drinking orgy. They cleaned out the skulls of some of their victims and used them as drinking cups. So these were some of the very disturbing stories that individuals who worked at Hadamar relayed to the Allied forces. Another war correspondent wrote on April 10th, 1945, 20,000 slain in Nazi House of Shutters. Officers found 300 babbling, insane creatures hiding in the dim recesses of the underground labyrinth or wandering about upstairs. They were what might be termed the permanent population, ones which were shown to visitors or when there was an inspection. So Allied forces, they use this type of language a lot, kind of for shock value. They use this in referring to the survivors at the camps as well, kind of to show that their humanity had been taken away. And in a sense it had. They had been dehumanized, treated in the most inhumane way possible. A British soldier who was a police officer in London probably thought he had seen everything in his 20 years of service. In 20 years of police experience at Bow Street, London, I've never heard anything like this. I've heard such stories, but I didn't believe them. Now I think anything is possible. So the shock value really got to all of the soldiers. They had never seen anything like this. And Major Fulton C. Vowell of the United States War Crimes Office, the discoveries at Hadamar constituted the most horrible example of Nazi brutality he had ever witnessed. So they start gathering evidence, looking at those intake records and death records. Many had been falsified, so it's unclear exactly how many victims there were. They uncovered the mass graves, and the Signal Corps photographers began taking pictures to document what they encountered. They also started interrogating the staff, questioning any survivors, and getting statements of the town people who had been witnesses to this. They exhumed and examined the remains in these mass graves, and pathology could tell them the cause of death and what their level of health was when they were murdered. The staff claimed that they had all been so sick, they were suffering from incurable illnesses and were close to death when they arrived. But autopsies found no evidence of advanced disease. And the bodies of these Soviet and Polish forced laborers showed that they were in relative health at the time they were murdered. These are some of the pictures in our collection. I wish I had more, but I was not able to scan as many as I wanted before the museum shut down. But this is just a small sampling of some of these photos that we have in our collection. Head doctor Adolf Wallman and male nurse Karl Willig upon their arrest. This is the head nurse Irmgard Huber and her being investigated or interrogated by the War Crimes Commission. Slightly disturbing, she's almost got a smirk on her face. But her family, when she was on trial, they wrote letters asking for clemency, saying that she was distraught, that this was just tearing her up inside, that she had been a part of this. You can, make your judgments if you believe that or not. This is a picture of some of the staff members at Hadamar. Some of them are smiling. It's almost like a yearbook photo. Some of the mass graves that were uncovered at Hadamar. Some of the bodies of the victims, some exhumed bodies. This is an American doctor doing a field autopsy on one of these victims. They found the body of an elderly man and two women. This is one of those women. And they had all been shot through the chest. And the staff insisted that those were suicides. So those deaths were labeled as suicides. Again, you can make your judgment call on that as well. The murder weapon of sorts, the bottles of morphine and other barbiturates found in the pharmacy. And then some of the survivors. a book containing some of the death records, many falsified, but this was very important, these death records, because they listed the nationality of the individual, which when it came to trial was crucial. So all these doctors were volunteers. They were specially selected because they were prepared to participate, and they all agreed to participate. They could have said no. They weren't threatened. They were never directly given an order to kill their so-called patients. And they agreed that they had to maintain absolute secrecy. And then many of those involved with Operation T4 were brought in to the death camps. T4 was kind of a test run, trying to figure out the most efficient way of killing mass quantities of people. So these people are brought into the camps to show them how to set up the gas chambers where 6 million Jews and millions of others lost their lives. So they were a specially selected group. So American legal authorities maintain that the killing of German nationals by German nationals was not subject to prosecution as a violation of international or wartime law. But the Allied forces who saw this, they were so shocked at what had occurred at Hadamar, and they couldn't just walk away. So the unjustified killing of foreign nationals under Germany could be tried for war crimes because each nation state had specific interest in the maintenance of international law. So they were able to charge 7 defendants with war crimes pertaining to the death of those over 400 Soviet and Polish prisoners. Because this was a violation of the Hague Convention and the Geneva Convention. It went against international wartime law. The murder and malnutrition of Allied, Polish, and Russian displaced nationals or forced laborers was a violation of the Geneva Convention on Rules of Land Warfare. So it's a bit like getting Al Capone on tax evasion. They wanted to get these individuals, these staff members and doctors on whatever charges that they could. So they were able to charge them with these war crimes based on those Russian and Polish prisoners. And they were able to determine who was the Russian and Polish prisoners because the cemetery caretaker said that the German prisoners who had been murdered were buried naked but with a number tag on their big toe. The Russian and Polish prisoners were buried and their underclothes did not have a tag on their toe. So they're able to look at the bodies of these foreign nationals who had been murdered and find the cause of death and see if they had advanced diseases which would have killed them anyways. So these are the 7 individuals put on trial: the director, Alphonse Klein, the chief doctor, Adolf Wallmann, the head male nurse, Heinrich Rolf, Karl Willig, another male nurse, Irmgard Huber, the head male nurse, or the female nurse, Philip Bloom, cemetery attendant, and Adolf Merkel, the registrar and bookkeeper. So the Hadamar trial began on October 8th, 1945, and ended on the 15th, October 15th. So the trial lasted just about a week, and it was the first mass atrocities trial after the war. Colonel Leon Droski was the lead prosecutor for the United States, and he obtained convictions against all 7 defendants. They all pled not guilty. The defenses, they offered up was that the war crimes had no jurisdiction. Well, they did have jurisdiction because it dealt with the killing of foreign nationals, which was a violation of international wartime law. Also offered up that they had to follow orders. They couldn't resign under fear of imprisonment or even death. That was considered erroneous as well, that there was no specific law saying that they had to do this. And they were all volunteers and they all agreed to be part of this program. So a trial statement by Colonel Dworsky. Oh, what a vicious falsehood. What a terrible thing. What an evil and wicked thing to do to a person who is already suffering and carrying burdens, to build up false hope that sunshine was to enter their hearts. They told them they would be given medication that would help them. Oh, they were given medications, medications of poison that grip their heart and close their eyelids still. That is the sort of medication they were given. So this is a list of the crimes that these defendants were charged with and their sentences. Alphonse Klein, the chief administrative officer, was sentenced to death by hanging. The head doctor, Adolf Wollmann, he was served a life sentence due to his advanced age. The two male nurses, Heinrich Rolf and Karl Willig, were given death sentences as well. Ermengarde Huber was given a 25-year sentence. Excuse me. "25-year sentence. Adolf Merkel, the records keeper, and Philip Bloom, the cemetery caretaker, both received 30 to 35-year sentences. So it was not until December of 1945 when the Allied forces passed the Allied Control Council Law number 10 that allowed for the more umbrella term and flexible charge of crimes against humanity, which covered all of the mass-scale atrocities of killing of Jews, Poles, Gypsies, and other populations. This covered euthanasia, but by 1946, the Hadamar Trial was over and euthanasia crimes were transferred back to German courts. So it was the job of the German courts now to deal with these euthanasia crimes. 25 staff members from Hadamar, including Dr. Wollmann and Nurse Huber, were brought up on charges of crimes against humanity. And a letter writing campaign for clemency by friends and family. It was a massive letter writing campaign. They got many letters asking for clemency and lenience. So they were only able to try those few Hadamar staff members on the basis of war crimes. All were convicted. Some were given life in prison, some the death penalty. And by the time other Nazi collaborators were tried for crimes against humanity, the Hadamar trial was completed. They were then tried again in German courts. 25 members were tried, 11 were convicted, but nearly all of them were released from prison in the 1950s. In the end, only 3 of the 7 original sentences were intact. Adolf Merkel, the records keeper, he was let go with time served. Ermengarde Huber, her sentence was commuted to 12 years. And Philip Bloom, his sentence of 30 to 35 years was commuted to 15. So no one was held accountable for the full extent of the atrocities at Hadamar and for the euthanasia program in general. There was a trial in Dresden in 1947, the doctor's trial, where let me see here. where two male nurses who had worked at one of these euthanasia centers was sentenced to death. There was also in 1965 a trial of 14 female nurses from another institution. They were put on trial, but were all found not guilty. So justice was really not served. And here we have an excerpt from a New Yorker article. We suspect that the long delay in the war trials has been not so much because there was no solid floor under a certain courtroom, as because there was no foundation under the new justice with which the victorious nations are now fumbling. Here are a handful of accused individuals of great renown, obviously guilty of rank deeds against society. The job is to make their trial look orderly and just, when in fact, they will have to be tried by makeshift processes and on, excuse me, and on charges of violating laws that are non-existent. The Allied peoples naturally want to punish these men as they deserve to be punished and are determined to do so. In order to do it, they face the queer task of holding an individual responsible for an act on an international level. To what page of what statute book does the learned judge turn? There isn't any book. There isn't any page. The justice is absent. The international government is absent. And so my sources. So if you want to look up some of these and learn a little bit more about it, I'll have those for you as well. So thank you guys. And if we want to have time for questions.
I have a comment and sort of a question. When you said Colonel Leon Jaworski, that name just sounded so familiar. And while you were talking, I just confirmed what I thought online here. And he was, Leon Jaworski was a special prosecutor during the Watergate trial in the 70s. It was the same guy.
Wow.
Oh,
and then the other thing is, if you could either confirm or correct a long-held assumption of mine, I've always wondered whether or not, given how societies, including our own, felt about, those who were mentally or physically challenged, 80, 85 years ago,
right.
Was it, am I giving them too much credit that the Nazis purposely started with that group because there perhaps would have been less of a public outcry, given again what society thought of those people at the time? And then, is that the first step down the slippery slope, or was it just a coincidence? It just so happened that they picked on that group first?
So I think it was kind of a first step down the slope. It was kind of, they were doing it kind of a test in a miniature form about the best way to commit this mass murder. There was some outcry. Some clergymen protested, but in general, there was that view by society that they were not as valuable and not as contributing. So I think that is true that they did target people with disabilities, mental illnesses, because they were vulnerable and there would have been less of an outcry, yes.
Thank you.
Megan, this is Steve Kamenetsky. I had a question.
Yeah.
In some of the reading I've been doing, it's apparent that there was a big eugenics movement in the United States
for sure
at this time, and I just wondered whether you ran across any Nazis using the justification for what they were doing simply by saying, well, it's copied by what the United States does.
So I think they did take a little bit of what they learned from us in the United States, because yes, eugenics was a movement here in the United States. There were, I don't know how many thousands of disabled Americans who were forcibly sterilized as well. So I think they did take some of that, but then they went kind of the next step.
Thank you.
Oh, Megan?
Okay. So first I want to say thank you for your clear imagery. I mean, this was really the best that I've ever heard about, exactly what happened in some of the really disgusting images, but I guess we needed to hear. And also your great research on this. So I wanted to say that. But next I want to ask a question. Okay, so it switched from gas chambers to morphine barbiturates. Was the reason it switched because they could hide it better that way? And did the clergy, it's kind of a two-part question, and did the clergy continue to, say this was wrong after they switched to the barbiturates? Did they continue to pursue, that this wouldn't happen anymore?
So the switch, I think because most of the staff thought it was more humane than the gassing. I mean, you heard the statements of some of the witnesses saying just how horrible it was, and that could not be considered humane. But it was also a little more discreet.
That's what.
So it was a little bit more. They were able to keep it a little bit more under wraps because of these protests.
Okay. The clergy continued to protest this even after it continued. You said it stopped for like a year or a while.
It stopped for a while, and I think people thought that it was kind of done and over with.
Megan, I have a question about the twins. That was considered a disability, which surprised me. And in fact, just recently, Eva Kaur died, and she was one that was part of the Mengele twins.
Right.
But why twins considered disabled? That's my question. Do you know why?
Targeting twins like with disabilities, or targeting, I know Mengele and other doctors like to perform experimentation on Romani twins, or twins who happen to be of mixed, Aryan and non-Aryan, or German and non-German. So they were targeted just because they were good test subjects.
Thank you.
I have a question. Excuse me. I'm curious, who donated, or do we know who donated the photographs?
So unfortunately, the donor wished to remain anonymous. We have to respect those wishes.
Certainly.
But it was donated by a woman. Her husband was a censor for the Army Signal Corps. So that means like they didn't, take out pertinent information, or they tried to, sugarcoat it. A censor would maybe take out the name of a town or a platoon number to kind of protect the movements of the soldiers.
Thank you.
This is Barb. Are there any ties to St. Louis with this story, and other than the donation of the collection?
I'll have to ask Diane a little bit more about that. I know that this particular gentleman was a St. Louisan, and so he lived here, and his
Megan,
wife donated it.
If there were about 20,000 people killed at Hadamar, but 200 to 250,000 total, how many similar institutes were there, and was there a coordination of any kind between the various ones?
Yeah, so there were 6 in Austria and Germany, and there were, I believe, about 5 or 6 in Poland. And they did kind of coordinate. They would kind of shuffle prisoners around. But in the early 1940s, Hadamar was really the only euthanasia center still in operation. The others, like Grafeneck, many of the staff members there were transferred to Hadamar. And that institution was shut down. Prisoners were taken, evacuated from there, sent to Hadamar, and some records destroyed.
This is Barb Hoffman. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I just have a comment to make. There is an excellent documentary. I believe it's part of the American Experience stuff on PBS on eugenics in America, in the United States.
I watched part of that.
Yeah.
I saw it.
It's great background for this, but my point is that while we didn't go the route of euthanasia, the United States used this idea of eugenics to justify treatment, particularly of Black Americans. And also wanted to mention that according to this, eugenics in general had gone sort of out of vogue in the 20s. In fact, there was one of their lead proponents came out and said that this is a false science, that this is wrong. But the Nazis continued on with it. But although we fortunately weren't involved with euthanasia in this regard, we were with sterilization. The last sterilization that was based on this idea of eugenics occurred in the 1950s. And it was not at all uncommon for citizens of the United States, Americans, to justify having their children that had various mental or physical disabilities, to have them sterilized.
Yes.
And it was totally legal. So I think
Yes,
that's
very true.
Background piece.